Hey there, welcome to the Stream Home Edition. I'm Josh Rushing, sitting in for the irreplaceable Femi. Okay, today we're talking about transracial adoption. Now, in the US, most babies who will be adopted are non-white, but 73% of those will be adopted by white parents. And this raises a whole host of questions about what does it mean for that child's culture, for their identity, particularly as they become adults. Now, if you're joining us on YouTube, I want you to be a part of the conversation. See that box over there? That's a live YouTube chat. And we have a stream producer in there waiting right now to get your questions and your comments into the show. They're going to get them to me, and I'm going to get them to our guest. Speaking of our guest, there are three different people who are involved in transracial adoptions in the US, all from a little bit of a different angle. And I'm going to ask them right now to introduce themselves. We're going to begin with Angela. Angela, can you tell us a bit about who you are?
Hi, sure. Yeah, my name is Angela Tucker, and I am a Black woman. Obviously, I was adopted from the South in Tennessee to Washington State with white parents in a predominantly white town. And I searched and found my birth parents in my mid-20s, and that's when I really started exploring and discovering my Blackness and my Black identity. I now run a post-adoption department in Seattle and really work towards centering adoptee voices.
Great. Now, and I'm going to toot your horn for a second here. You got a movie Closure that people should check out. They can get that pretty much anywhere that streams at this point. Is that right? Amazon,
Yeah,
Apple? Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. And then you
Amazon
got a
Prime.
podcast. You got a podcast coming out. Is it tomorrow? When's the
Tomorrow
fourth?
is the first,
Tomorrow, your
yes.
podcast. Okay. What's the podcast called?
The podcast is called The Adoptee Next Door.
And
And
where can
my
people find it?
first guest, well, people can find it anywhere you get your
Normal podcast.
podcasts, Apple,
Okay.
Spotify, Stitcher. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Nicole, you know something about this too. You wrote a book called, what is it? All We Can Ever Know. Is that right?
All You Can Ever Know, that's right. It's a memoir about growing up transracially adopted in a small white town in Southern Oregon. I'm actually the daughter of Korean immigrants, so my birth parents immigrated to the US shortly before I was born. So I'm the first member of my birth family born here. Grew up in a closed adoption, like knew nothing really about my origins, and decided to search for my birth family in my mid to late 20s while I was pregnant with my first child. Was really kind of the impetus for my search, and I wrote about it in a memoir called All You Can Ever Know.
Oh, it just happens to be right over your shoulder there. Huh.
Yes.
And we didn't say your full name in the introduction there, but it's Nicole Chung.
Thank you.
And moving on to Kia. Kia, you founded Raising Cultures, right? Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, my name is Kia Jones Baldwin. I founded Raising Cultures after I adopted two biracial children and a Caucasian son. And I kind of found that it was very difficult to get any resources as a transracially adoptive parent, especially the other way around. We've experienced a lot of different prejudices and racism due to that, and it's just been a crazy whirlwind of things. And so I'm trying to bring awareness to transracial adoption the other way.
What do you mean other way around? And when you say you've experienced like crazy things of racism, what are you talking about?
When I say the other way, basically when Caucasian families adopt African American children or brown children, it's not quote unquote frowned upon, or it's normal to see that in society. However, when African American families adopt a white child, we get a lot of backlash from both communities, from the Black community saying, well, why didn't you adopt a Black child? There's so many Black children that need care. And then we get it from the Caucasian side, well, why didn't you leave this white baby in a white family? So it's been wild.
Angela, what's it like being raised outside of your culture? What's been the impact on your life?
Well, it's a lot of impacts.
I framed that question wrong. Outside of your culture, I'm assuming what your culture, what is your culture? Like I just loaded that question with this, right? Assumption.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm a Black woman proudly, and I was raised completely outside of my culture. And I think to add on what Kia was saying, that what she means when she says the other way around is that for white parents, so for my parents, for example, I was always met with people running up to them saying, "What a great thing you've done. How wonderful that you've adopted this child." And I can understand from Kia's perspective, she gets the complete opposite. But it was, my childhood was lovely. My parents are fantastic, but I was raised in racial homogeneity. And so that really leads to a lot of tokenism and a lot of me just automatically being the educator just by walking through the world every day, that people are always curious about where I came from, how I got there, wanting to touch my hair, wanting to put their like tan skin up against my brown skin. And that was just the norm. And to grow up in that presents difficulties, not just for me trying to figure out like what does blackness mean for me, because I didn't have any representation, but it also creates this strange, it was like I had white privilege by osmosis is how I felt, that I was accepted because I had white parents next to me. But it all changed when I went to college and left the home. And all of a sudden, I'm just a Black person. And I went to a predominantly Black college and university. And so, or a predominantly white college. And so people around are like, "I don't understand why you chose this college. Why are you here?" That kind of thing. Even though that's what I grew up with and that's what I knew.
We're getting some YouTube comments in here. One's from Tiffany Hinnis that says Nicole's book was amazing. She articulated things I've experienced as transracial adoptee, and it was amazing. So you're really speaking to people out there, Nicole. I want to bring in a voice from our community. This is Hannah Yates, and she's a foster mom who's about to go through with a transracial adoption.
I am a foster parent, soon to be an adoptive parent from Kona, Hawaii, and we're in the middle of a transracial adoption. As a white person, I have felt total guilt, but even guilt before my race. I felt guilt that I was raising another woman's child, to be honest. But here's the thing with adoption is that I think the number one concern is the child safe and are they healthy? And then through that, we can navigate through the waters of race. And as white parents, it's our responsibility to be super conscious of all of our efforts towards their heritage and towards their ethnicity.
Nicole, what kind of advice would you give Hannah there?
It's hard, I never feel super qualified to give advice, but I can say, when I talk with people who are considering transracial adoption, and overwhelmingly who I hear from are white parents who are considering adopting across racial lines. The first thing that I usually suggest they do is take a good hard look at their community. And by that, I don't just mean the town or the city that they live in. I mean, like, look at their neighborhood, look at the schools that their kids would go to. If they're part of community organizations or religious organizations, take a look at those and ask yourself, what kind of environment would this be if I were bringing a child of color into it? Would they find mirrors? Would they find any peers who look like them? Would they find role models and friends who look like them? I think that is like one, not by no means the only question, but one question, like one place to start. And then the other thing I would say is that we hear a lot more in transracial adoption these days about like honoring a child's heritage and celebrating it. And I think that's all to the good. I think it's a great development. And there are more opportunities certainly than there were like when I was growing up. I think a lot of families gravitate toward these things because they're fun. Like they can be a lot of fun to explore like the child's culture of origin, maybe like the music, the food. But what I found is that, of course, it's like a lot harder to have those conversations about race and about white privilege and about white supremacy, like in this country, just the way that it permeates our culture. It's a lot less fun to talk about. We know from studies that a lot of white parents don't talk with like their biological kids about race or racism quite enough. Whereas often parents of color sort of have to, and so I think like being able to have those harder conversations, knowing those are coming, and being like just as ready to do that as you are to celebrate the child's culture. That's just a couple of places that I generally start. I feel like you could say a lot about this, but those are kind of the first two things that I mentioned.
Angela, you actually do counsel people on these issues, right? And we have a couple more questions from our YouTube audience. That is, do you feel comfortable claiming your racial/ethnic identity, even though you were raised outside of the culture? And another one, how did your adoptive parents talk to you about race and differences? What was that conversation like, Angela?
Oh, yeah, I definitely feel comfortable as a Black woman now. And I definitely identify strongly that way. I think the one thing, though, going back to Nicole's question, is there are many white people who choose to adopt or foster children of color. And as Nicole said, it's really important to look at your community and see, if there is racial diversity within. But another question that I ask families to think about is, why hasn't there been diversity in your family, in your life, before you chose to adopt a child? That it can feel really like a big burden almost if parents are only coming to think about racism and start these conversations because of us, because they got us. So that's one thing I think that my parents did well, which was I was not the impetus for them to learn about their own whiteness and their white privilege, that they had an interest in cultures across the board before I came. And they were also very aware of their positionality and why it was such that they could adopt me instead of Black families, and that was rooted in white supremacy. I was really grateful that they were that was kind of the foundation, because it allowed me to ask questions without them feeling defensive. Questions like, why didn't a Black family adopt me? Why were the choices so slim? And so then we were talking about how their institutional racism is baked into child welfare as well. And that was really comforting for me. Not in the sense of understanding my Blackness and my Black identity, but in the sense of understanding why I was shipped across the country to be raised by these white strangers.
Mm-hmm. And Kia, I'm curious, as a parent, what kind of conversations you have with your white son about race in America? I imagine explaining whiteness in America to your son must be trying to explain like what water is to a fish. I mean, is it a different kind of conversation?
Yeah, well, right now my son is 3 years old. So he's really, not understanding anything other than we are his parents. However, my husband, he is a police officer. And with everything going on with, protests and all of these things, it becomes increasingly difficult to try to talk to our biracial children and our African American daughter about racism without our son, who is 3, kind of joining in on the conversation. He's very intelligent. And so I can imagine the conversations that I'm going to have with him when he is getting ready to attend kindergarten. And we walk him into class on the first day as African American parents. And when we run into these things, because I do have a 3rd grade son who's biracial, who's ran into, if you're biracial, then why do you have 2 Black parents? And he's only in the 3rd grade. And so kids are, can be very observant, but very cruel as well. And, going back to something that Angela said, which was make sure that your children are educated on, race relations and conversations, because it can make an increasingly difficult situation for transracial adoptees when they are in these classroom situations.
Oh, I bet. I'm going to go to my computer here and show a stat. This is how long babies wait in foster care by race. And African American babies wait on average 39.4 months compared to white babies, which is really about half of that. Kia, I know you talked about this in the pre-interview that I read that said about the adoptive assistance. Can you kind of explain that story and the way that went down?
Yes. So, I was naive when I first started this whole the adoption. And my biracial son, when he was adopted, he was also a part of a sibling group. But as we all know, if you're biracial, most of the time you're considered African American by those that really don't understand. They're just looking at your skin tone. And it was told to me by a foster care supervisor at the time when I was adopting, my husband and I were adopting our Caucasian son, that he would not qualify for adoptions assistance. And, luckily and thank God, we didn't need the assistance. However, I wanted to know why. So I questioned her. Well, when we adopted our biracial son, he received adoptions assistance. So what's the difference? And she said, "Oh, well, he's under 3 and he's Caucasian and he's blue eyed and blonde hair. And so I would not have a problem with placing him." And I was just kind of floored, like, "Oh, so you guys are on a star system with the way that place children for adoption." And it's unfortunate that African American children are in the foster care system, and most of the time they age out without ever being adopted. And it's also unfortunate that it is a star system where Caucasian children are more likely to be adopted than children of color.
We actually have a Caucasian mom, Kim Van Brunt, in our community who sent us this video.
When it comes to the issue of white privilege and raising 2 Black children as a white person, it's complicated because right now, when they're young, they are protected kind of in a bubble of my white privilege when we go out and about together. But I know that it will not always be this way, especially as they get older. And so we do a lot of talking about these issues. We talk about racism in America. We talk about the realities of being a Black person in America. We teach them to be proud of who they are and to live fearlessly. And these things are hard to talk about, and it's heartbreaking to expose them to the realities of these issues in this country. And it's necessary because I'm hoping that what we're teaching them today will help them survive as they get older.
Angela, on the back of that, we have a comment from someone in our community, Kelly Lapp. She's on YouTube right now. As a white adoptive parent, how can I respond to the inappropriate questions in public, like where is she from or hair touching, etc., to affirm my daughter?
Yeah. Well, I find it so important that we center adoptees and that adoptive parents often are kind of creating and shaping the narrative, where in reality, for me, it was really important to learn at an early age how I wanted to respond to those intrusive questions that everyone asked. And so my parents, we did a little bit of role play before I went to elementary school. And so when people asked me, like, where's your real parents? I had a pat answer ready. And my answer in elementary school was like, I've pinched my mom before and she says, ow. So I know she's real. Like, it was really kitschy, really age appropriate. And it succeeded in the goal of just taking the pressure off of me to over explain or to let people in on some of my private details that I maybe didn't want to share. That it's important for us as adoptees to figure out how can we answer people's questions without telling them our whole history of, I was born here and abandoned there. And it's like, there's a phenomenon called narrative burden, which means that we are sharing our truths because of people's kind of entitled curiosity rather than sharing our truths because we actually want to. So those intrusive questions, where are they from? Instead of saying whatever it may be, I was abandoned under a bridge, and so then I got adopted and then I ended up in this state and I'm at the school now. Instead of doing that, I was able to have like this pat answer. So then when I went home, I could talk to my parents like, oh, someone asked me this question again. I'm so frustrated. But I didn't have to do that like on the spot, because when you're in elementary school, like all you want to do is fit in, and it's hard enough. I think I have one thought though related to Kim, who was basically talking about how she talks to her kids a lot about race. I was recently working with a teenage transracial adoptee, and she was telling me about how when her white parents talk to her about racism within America, she feels like they do it in an apologetic way. Like, I'm so sorry that you're going to have to deal with this, but this is the reality, and very, very kind of sad about it. And this transracial adopted teen went to one of her friends' houses, a Black friend who has Black parents who was not adopted. And those parents were talking to both of them about policing in America. And those parents were doing it in just an emphatic way that was not apologetic. And she came away feeling like, are my parents equipping me well enough? Because she saw the stark differences in how these two people were talking to their kids. And I think it's rooted in the fact that white parents just don't know what it's like to be Black. You can never know. And so there's some pieces that I think need to be outsourced, and a Black person who's lived it has to talk to that Black transracial adoptee in order to really get the point across.
Nicole, I see you nodding over there. Is that something
Oh,
that hits home?
I'm just kind of thinking about how, I was relating to a little bit of what Angela said. I'm obviously not Black, but I grew up in a really white community. I was actually the only Korean person I knew until I left home for college. So I was just thinking about how much I would have really liked to have other Asian Americans and Korean Americans that I was close to growing up, because that would have been maybe an opportunity to have some of those talks with people who shared my background and also could sort of teach me how to be emphatic and to be proud of it and to understand kind of what it meant. Like, I think one issue is that, certainly not all, but like a lot of adoptees who grow up in white families or white communities do grow up in this kind of racial and cultural isolation where they may not have access to people like that. I was just thinking, like, agreeing that with Angela, it sounded like a very powerful conversation that this adoptee got to have with her friend's parents. And I started to have those experiences like in college and actually with some of my college friends' families, and have had more experiences like that with my birth family as I've gotten older, but it was sort of late in coming. I think too about like what it means for even white parents who live in very diverse communities to kind of, if they don't already have a diverse circle of friends or a community, if they're looking to as Angela said, like kind of outsource some of those conversations, how are they going to try to gain access? Is it going to be in a way that's like, very like respectful of those communities and those people involved? That's another question that I have, because I have definitely also been that transracial adoptee that like white parents who have honestly very few or no friends of color go to for reassurance and to tell them it's going to be okay, like you're going to be fine, and to give advice. And I think you also have to think about how you're really going to have those conversations as parents, how you're going to approach, if you know whether it's transracial adoptees or just like other people who share your child's background. What are those conversations going to be like? And again, it's ideal if you're not just starting them after you've adopted transracially.
Yes.
Kia, I see you nodding on that. What are you thinking over there?
Yes, definitely representation matters. It is one of the most important things to how as it relates to transracial adopt. I feel I'm not an adoptee, so I can't relate in that aspect, but on raising cultures, I definitely get a lot of questions from parents asking about different things they can do in order to keep their children connected to their culture, whether it's taking your child to a barbershop where they'll get that exposure, or getting them a book by an African American author or Korean author. Letting them
Kia,
engage.
we got less than 30 seconds left in the show here, so I'm going to stop, but I love where you're pointing this to about getting educated. All of my guests today are on social media, either Raising Cultures or through podcasts and through books. You can find them there. And I think that's a key to this really is getting educated and having a conversation about this. It may have started right here on the stream. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you tomorrow.